Welcome to the Psychedelia Podcast, where we talk about the third wave of psychedelics. Through our many wide-ranging conversations with scientists, policymakers, entrepreneurs, and event organizers, we bring you an exclusive look into the many minds of the psychedelic world. It's time to let the word out about psychedelics and how they can be used as tools to benefit both the individual and the community. Welcome to the third wave.
Welcome to the first episode of the Third Wave podcast. I'm your host, Paul Austin, and we brought a very special guest for you today on this very first podcast. His name is Jesse Jarnow, and he is the author of Heads, a Biography of Psychedelic America. So, Jesse, before I go any further, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
It was great to read your book, and I've read a few of the other books about psychedelic history, and I felt like yours took a whole new narrative and a whole new angle, which I really enjoyed and which we're going to dig into very soon. But before we get to that, I think, a critical part of you writing this book was also your past. Can you tell us a little bit about, what inspired you to write this book and how did your experience with psychedelics play into that?
Well, I think what inspired me to write this book was having I wouldn't necessarily say lifelong, but, certainly post-teenage lifelong interest in psychedelics and wanting to know the story, just, kind of wanting to be able to connect these historical pieces together. I grew up in the 80s and the 90s, and obviously a lot of people, especially in the 80s and the 90s, would tag psychedelics to the 60s, except for the fact that growing up in the 80s and 90s, psychedelics were so prevalent in my schools, and especially in my high school. And I found out much later, when I kind of in the period just before I started writing this book, that was actually the second peak of LSD use and psychedelics in the United States was sort of the early to mid 90s, peaking in 1996, which was when something like, I think 9.6% of high school seniors or something like that said that they had used LSD in the previous year. Mm-hmm. And I graduated from high school in 1997, so I am very much, I wasn't actually using psychedelics yet in high school, but I'm still very much part of that wave and that statistic. My personal path kind of into all of that, a large part of that, in some senses, is that my parents are both kind of counterculture types. My dad maybe more than my mom, but, my dad, dropped out of college and hit, went to California in the 60s and, had his psychedelic experiences and came back and channeled that into an art career that was and is very, very psychedelic, and, which I think probably has a lot to do with the way his brain worked even before that. So I grew up in a household where I definitely didn't get the standard, don't do drugs kind of talk. It was more like a lot of drugs can be really harmful, but some drugs can be very helpful and beneficial. And if you don't abuse them and don't just run away and join the circus, it's a perfectly safe and normal part of growing up. And that was, and I think my dad gave me some Carlos Castaneda to read or something like that. So that was kind of like the deepest background. So in high school, I, started discovering music and started, eventually found my way into sort of psychedelic stuff from the 60s. And, kind of through my dad's record collection and through other methods, and ended up getting into the Grateful Dead, and pretty swiftly after that reading The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test by Tom Wolfe, which was probably really my first introduction to what LSD was, other than some, probably some passing references here or there. And like I was saying, it was prevalent in my high school, but I was kind of a late bloomer on that front and didn't really start engaging with psychedelics personally or, chemically until college. So I kind of had a couple of years of reading about them and reading about that world before I entered it fully.
And I think I think that's really interesting, because that, I think, is very unique to some degree, at least from the stories that I've heard and that I've been exposed to, because it seems like, for example, a lot of people, it seems like they've read like a post on Arrowwood, and then they go and they drop LSD, or they eat like a handful of mushrooms, or maybe they watch like a Terrence McKenna video on YouTube. Whereas with you, it's like this, like you said, your dad was out in California in the 60s, like in a way you had tons of exposure leading up to that. So I'd be curious, how did that play a role in that first psychedelic experience that you had then?
Well, I mean, I think it probably it played some backwards roles. You know, both my parents are big readers, so we definitely had other books besides the Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test in the house. I think we had and I didn't get to these until after Acid Test, but the Variety of Psychedelic Experiences or something like that by Gene Houston, and I think there were a couple other sort of paperbacks from the mid to late 60s that sort of got into that. And I think that growing up in a house in sort of a book-filled household probably played a large part in both my interest in psychedelics, but also my reticence to take them. And I think that's, maybe a large part of my personality is that I don't really just, hop into things like that. And there also wasn't Erowid to look into at that point, or right. McKenna videos to watch. It was, kind of a matter of, I certainly went through an anti-drug class in junior high school and was, very, very, very aware of, the this is your brain on drugs kind of anti-drug propaganda that was going on. And I could tell instantly, just before I knew anything, anything about drugs, I knew those ads were totally full of it. And that wasn't even based on talking to my dad or talking to anybody who had any experience. It was just so obvious to me as a, however old I was in 1988, 10 years old when those ads started airing.
Was it about those ads that made you go okay, this is obviously a bunch of shit, It
was just that institutional tone, just that you're lying to me, there are teachers that I loved in school, really, teachers who had really profound effects on me, but also people that I encountered at every level of school, just square adults who I knew weren't telling me everything, And I think that's probably pretty obvious to most kids at that age, that you can tell the difference between an adult who's talking to you on the level and an adult who's talking down to you. And that the whole, I think it was the any questions at the end. This is your brain on drugs. Any questions? It's so condescending. And it's yes, I have some questions, but I'm not asking you. You're not going to tell me. So I think all of those things fed in, and like I said, I am kind of a reticent person like that, and I did have a lot of questions, and it's not even I got to college and immediately I'm going to take drugs now. It was really kind of a slow entry point for me. It's I kind of knew it was where I was going, but it was also something that I was aware of as being heavy and potentially very meaningful and, potentially kind of scary. I don't like roller coasters either, And eventually I got over that. I'm still not a crazy macrodosing psychonaut. I definitely never, ever became that, as much as maybe I sometimes wish I did. I think I still have a healthy fear and respect for the power of psychedelics after 20 years of taking them on and off.
A reverence, I would imagine, that you cultivated and established for the power and the potential of psychedelics. Yeah.
And I wouldn't necessarily reverence is definitely an accurate word for it, but it's also not sacred to me in the same way that I think it is to in some belief sets and some practices. And I think that actually ties into what got me interested in writing and learning about the history of psychedelics, was becoming aware of this real multiplicity of practices, that there were there were people who just think nothing of taking acid and just, on a weekday, just going out and hanging out. Yeah, I'm just dosing today. It's cool. And, that's one end of it. And then there were definitely people that I encountered in sort of live music situations who were really ritualistic about it, but also at the same time, very sort of DIY and it's not like they were following these strictures or, this thousands of year old tradition. They were kind of going on these practices that they had kind of derived themselves after doing psychedelics for a certain amount of years. And then of course I became aware of, simultaneous to all this, psychedelic practices that have been used for centuries or longer, that are really fit into the society that they came out of. And that was something that was really eye-opening for me, especially, like I was saying, kind of in the late 80s and early 90s at this sort of the tail end of this drug war, or not even the tail end, but kind of the sort of the peak of the Reagan-Bush years before things got a little slightly more liberalized. But just being aware, on one hand, that these drugs are criminalized and stigmatized in the United States, but yet in other cultures and other places, there's a framework for them and an acceptance for them and all of that. And that really fascinated me. And in turn kind of inspired me to sort of think about how these drug traditions or practices or whatever kind of established themselves in the United States and became kind of their own thing. And that's really kind of what my book is about in a lot of ways, is that, there's obviously tons of studies of ayahuasca and the way that's fit into, all these, religious systems in South America and beyond. And I'm interested in the way that the United States kind of has its own post-colonial psychedelic culture that does exist among, hippies, basically.
And deadheads, right? Which is what you wrote about extensively in the book.
Right, but also, and treating, to me, the way I treat deadheads in the book and the way I think about the deadhead psychedelic practice is kind of almost as the mainstream of American psychedelics. If you think about, whatever percentage of it is, of Americans that are using psychedelics, let's say it's, 4% or something like that, or 5%, something fairly small, kind of, at least while I was growing up, and the bulk of those users, like the vast percentage of those, were probably connected in some way to kind of what we think of as the counterculture or the Grateful Dead world. But we're only, if you think about like mainstream culture, there's obviously so much that exists beyond the fringes of mainstream culture. There's so much psychedelic culture that exists beyond the fringe of the Grateful Dead world. They were just kind of the thread that connects all of the things and is sort of something that all the different groups kind of can reflect off of, because it existed for so long and as such this unbroken thing, and still does to a large degree. It's still, the dead world is still massive, give or take the dead themselves.
I mean, and I know I'm from West Michigan, so I know the Grateful Dead will still play. The closest one I think is at Soldier Field in Chicago, where they'll play, and they will sell out the entire stadium for like 3 nights in a row. So it's definitely well alive still today.
Yeah, for sure. And so wanting to be able to kind of understand those things and how they fit together, because I kind of maybe growing up as a Dead fan had a bit of an instinctual understanding of how that part of it worked. But I was aware of Terence McKenna and was aware of, kind of these various threads connected to magazines like Mondo 2000, which are kind of like these proto-consciousness hacking groups. And, all that stuff was, and definitely I was aware of that getting on the internet in the early 90s, kind of pre-World Wide Web. The internet definitely had this really unsettled, almost countercultural feel to it, just because it was only kind of fringe people and academics were kind of who were on the internet. And
Timothy Leary, which is hilarious because he was like, I remember reading about this, he was obsessed with the internet when it came out.
Yeah, totally. And there's, and for me getting on the net in, when was it, 92 or 93, it was like, it was just very obvious that that there was such a thread between that world, between the technology world and kind of this emerging internet and the counterculture. Like I remember reading about and exploring The Well, which was I still have a Well email address, which stands for Whole Earth Electronic Link, which grew out of Stuart Brand's Whole Earth catalog. I found out later that the people actually running The Well were ex-residents of The Farm, which was, the giant commune in Tennessee that grew out of the San Francisco scene that evolved out of that. That was really kind of my introduction into the present tense of the psychedelic world, was discovering that sort of technological crossover there.
Interesting. And just, this first part, you've brought up a lot of interesting points, but I want to go back a bit and I want to dig into an interesting point which you brought up, which was, the psychedelic cultures that existed, we could say pre-Renaissance, or we could even say pre-World War II or World War I era, basically before the United States had such an impact on the global war on drugs. There were these psychedelic cultures that existed as far back as many, many thousands of years. Were there any particular ones that you thought were interesting or fascinating that you read about or that you studied that you thought this is really interesting, or I never knew about this before, or anything like that?
I guess the one that I really connected to or really tried to read about somewhat was peyote. And part of that is because it is North American. It does grow in North America and Central America, and was really kind of the first psychedelic to kind of to jump into sort of white American culture.
Right.
And to me, I guess the interest in that is because I know because I've read what I've read, I know American history better than I know, history from other cultures. So it was a little bit easier for me to read about the Native American church and sort of American peyote traditions and be able to contextualize that myself without having to rely on other authors and sort of the way, however the studies were framing them. I had a little bit more of a knowledge of what else was going on in turn of the century America. So that was really interesting to me, reading about kind of the modernization of the Native American church and kind of reading about these age-old peyote traditions and then how kind of in the 19th century it seems like they fused a little bit with American Christian traditions, and also seeing how they kind of fit into the American economic system of the mid-20th century, where you see just things like, the arrival of the interstate system having an impact on the way peyote is distributed, or the arrival of mail. The fact by the 50s you could literally mail order peyote from Texas, which is how Allen Ginsberg got it when he wrote Howl, and sort of how it arrived in New York. That was probably for me, that was kind of like the pre-World War II interest that I kind of followed the most, besides, just the introduction of LSD, which is, I guess, sort of contemporaneous with World War II.
Right, and just for our listeners at home, one that came to mind as well for me was the mysteries in ancient Greece.
Oh yeah, that's so. I wish. Yeah, that's something that I want to read even more about.
Yeah, and it seems like I think Albert Hoffman and Gordon Wasson, they did some primary source research on that, and I feel like they have written a book on it.
Yeah, there's one from the 70s called the Road to Eleusis, I believe.
Yes, I believe that, or Elysian, Elysian Mysteries, I believe.
Yeah. Well, the place. Yeah, the place is, my pronunciation is just generally awful. I'm a gringo, man. And yeah, but that there were, these ancient Greek mystery cults using the same theory, or what they wrote about was these ancient Greek mystery cults using a drug derived from the same substance, the same fungus that produces the precursor for LSD. Mm-hmm. And these were enormous cults in that era of Greece, where you have, I think Aristotle and possibly Socrates. It was really like the elite of Greek society.
Absolutely.
We're part of these. And that's fascinating. It's very fascinating to me for obvious reasons.
And they were sworn to absolute secrecy as well. They would do, I believe, my numbers are going to be a bit off maybe on this, but they would do smaller ones every few months. And everyone was sworn to secrecy who would drink what they called this kykeon beverage, which was made from the precursor of LSD, the ergot fungus. And then every 5 years, I believe it was, they would do this massive rite. And I always have been fascinated with that as well. And this went well past, into the time of Christianity and past the time of Christianity, pretty much until Constantine, who was the first Roman emperor who declared Christianity to be the official religion of the Roman Empire, put the nix on it because basically by putting a nix on that, as well as a lot of the Gnostics that were at that time, he was able to monopolize mysticism in a way. He was able to monopolize the experience of God, which led to really the first underpinnings of the patriarchy and this idea of power that's consolidated into the hands of few.
Yeah, definitely +1 to all of that. Yeah. One of the things that also intrigues me about both the accounts of that, and likewise with peyote, is that you get also these notes in there of occasional anecdotes of people absconding with the sacred medicine and taking it recreationally. And, you have these reports of people doing it outside the scope of the rituals and getting punished for that, or at least getting called out for that. So that's fascinating to me as well, as kind of this sort of this anti-authoritarian bent that seems to emerge somewhat naturally with the presence of psychedelics.
And I think that then speaks to almost the nature of humanity as well, because this is not only then about the psychedelic experience, but it's also something that, Joseph Campbell has spoken extensively and written extensively about. It's this experience of needing to experience ecstasy, basically this experience of needing to go past duality into non-duality. The sense of oneness, what Aldous Huxley has wrote about. And I think that is also inherent to human nature, right? We also need that, which I think plays in nicely to, this biography of Psychedelic America, because I think this was in large part what the counterculture was about.
Yeah.
Was that lashback against a society that had turned just completely conformist and had lost any type of uniqueness to it.
Right. It's probably a large scale reaction, sort of, I think maybe in the same way that I reacted to those, Just Say No ads. Just sort of, obvious to a large amount of people that kind of the institutions that were ostensibly serving us are probably a lot blander and a lot more square and a lot, less truthful than they make themselves out to be. And psychedelics, I think, offered a pretty swift and obvious path away from those things.
Yeah. Absolutely. So let's get into that now. What was then the beginning of Psychedelic America? Where would you say it started?
Well, the moment that I tried to pinpoint, I was really trying to find. Well, I guess it depends what you mean by Psychedelic America. And when I write about Psychedelic America, I really mean kind of this post-colonial Psychedelic America. Because like I was saying, there's, traditions of peyote use going back, mushrooms obviously exist in Central America. So for me, I was trying to pinpoint the moment when psychedelics arrived in the United States and were available sort of freely, in the sense that you didn't have to be part of a previously existing belief set, you didn't have to know a therapist, you didn't have to qualify. You could just find them and try them for yourselves, which I think is kind of this distinctly American thing, where it's the context is kind of liberated, and you it's sort of up to you to kind of create the context which you're using them in, which I think eventually then leads to sort of what I was talking about before, like these vast American kind of DIY belief sets that are sort of mix and match from different spiritual traditions. And so I was really trying to pinpoint the moment when that happened, when psychedelics hit the street. And the earliest point I could really find on that was the 50s, was people mail ordering from Texas and packaging peyote to resell. And there were hints of things like that maybe a little bit before, mescaline was, peyote was certainly featured in patent medicines, and there are examples of people drinking it during the Civil War, of drinking like sort of distilled peyote water or something like that. But to me, the moment it really like connected and began to create this like network that wasn't just sort of isolated pockets of people, trying it and messing around, was kind of that sort of the mid to late 50s. That's where Heads begins, is this shop in the East Village that I heard about called the $sign Cafe, which was run by this, sort of early libertarian named Baron Bruckless. And he mail ordered peyote and sold it over the counter in capsule form. And it became this, little countercultural hangout for musicians and writers and whatnot in the East Village. And that's sort of like the beginning of this chain where these people are, you read kind of like the early trip reports, or I talk to some of these people, and they don't, they knew that peyote was this ancient tradition, but it's not like they have access to the roadmen or whoever was running the peyote ceremonies. They were just trying it for themselves, and because of that, it was kind of like this blank slate, and that I think is where all this stuff began. People sort of triangulating between the substances that they were able to get, but also the material that they were able to read about. Gordon Wasson wrote, another starting point maybe for Psychedelic America was this big Life magazine cover story from 1957 about Gordon Wasson and his wife Valentina traveling to Mexico and experiencing mushrooms. in a traditional context. And that really, I think, probably had a very big impact. A lot of people read that story. But then the psychedelics themselves weren't really like available to people until a few years after that. So there's kind of this like period of 5 or 6 years, I think, where psychedelics were very prevalent in the popular press. You would read about people like Cary Grant taking them and having kind of amazing therapeutic experiences with psychedelics. So there was a lot of, there's actually a book called Acid Hype, which is by Stephen Siff, S-I-F-F, which is a really great academic look at the way psychedelics were covered in the media between the invention, I think these are the dates he says, basically between the invention of LSD by Albert Hofmann in 1938/1943, and then up to the point when they become illegal, and sort of tracing the way that balance shifts between positive coverage initially and then later enough negative coverage that they become illegal. So there's that period where psychedelic America is kind of forming, I'd say, between like, say, 1957 and 1967, I think, is when these sort of belief sets started to emerge and when the legal status was really defined, and these beliefs were then kind of sort of forced into secret societies or something like that is part of it as well.
And I think that's interesting that you brought up the peyote story of it being shipped to New York as the beginning of it, because normally when I speak to people, I mention the Gordon Wasson story, right? I mentioned, how he went to Maria Sabina in Oaxaca and he found these magic mushrooms and he took them, he was a famous mycologist and, he was, I think, a vice president at JP Morgan or something. And then, of course, came back and wrote this Life magazine. So I think that angle on it, the peyote angle, is very interesting. And it helps to explain why then you had specifically Aldous Huxley, who was the best writers of the 20th century. Right. Why he did mescaline before he touched LSD, for example. And I didn't know that. Like, I didn't know that it was being shipped all over from Texas or Mexico until I read your book, which I thought was fascinating, which I'm glad.
Psychedelic literature being more available than the psychedelics themselves, and the ability to read about it before actually experiencing it. That was another book that was on my dad's bookshelf for sure. Was The Doors of Perception. Mm-hmm. And I think he played a huge role in that as well. I mean, the word psychedelic itself didn't even exist until 1957, I think. So that would be as good a place to begin to, psychedelic America as any.
No, and absolutely. And the story behind that is really interesting, right? Well, basically, Aldous Huxley and Humphrey Osmond were exchanging letters. And to discuss Humphrey Osmond would take a little bit more time. And Huxley actually proposed a word, and I don't remember it offhand. And it was kind of clunky. And Osmond wrote back and said, "Hey, what about psychedelic? Well, why not that? Mind manifesting."
Phenethylamine. I think that was it.
Yeah. And psychedelic stuck, and then we had it. And I think that other point that Aldous Huxley did play and still plays such a tremendous role in what's going on today, because he really, when he towards the end of his life, when he was really pushing hard for these, he even had conversations with Timothy Leary where they spoke about the necessity of not trying to spread this far and wide. Which, of course, Timothy Leary did not listen to.
Ignored pretty swiftly.
And basically this led then to the next stage, which I want to get into next, is like the 60s, right? The peak, which was really Timothy Leary and the projects at Harvard, and then Ken Kesey and the acid tests, which led to the Warlocks. Let's talk a little bit about that. Where did it lead after that?
Yeah, well, so Leary is kind of this transition moment between the early phase of psychedelic research and there being kind of these quote unquote legitimate examinations of what its potential. You read about the miracle at Marsh Chapel and these sort of early breakthroughs at Harvard. But psychedelics make people make pronouncements. They're a pretty inspiring thing, and Leary brought it pretty quickly into the mainstream. But I think the thing that really made stuff explode was the arrival of LSD, which was really produced by a guy named Owsley Stanley III, who went on to become the Grateful Dead's first patron with his LSD money. But he produced in 1965 the first really massive batches of LSD that were meant for basically public distribution and consumption. LSD still being legal at that point. And, I think that probably did as much to turn the tide for LSD as Leary did, just the fact that it was available. And Owsley connected with the Dead, who are known briefly as the Warlocks, through Ken Kesey's acid tests. And Kesey, Ken Kesey was the author of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, also connected to kind of this early phase of psychedelic research where he was a test subject basically in Silicon Valley, where he was given a variety of substances to, see how he reacted. And then he sort of took it upon himself to track those things down. He got a job. I can't remember if he had the job before or after that at the hospital where the tests were, but had a job as a night watchman, and I think, maybe procured some from the supply closet for himself. And from there, it really just, it blew up because psychedelic scene fused in 1965 and 1966 with this really vibrant art scene that we think of now as psychedelia, and got all this national coverage where kind of, again, the news of psychedelics traveled more swiftly than the psychedelics themselves did, and blossomed into this network where all these different groups were kind of linked together under this umbrella of psychedelics, where you have the music and the culture on one hand, but you also have these kind of emerging spiritual ideas. You also, you have these, back to the land notions of utopianism, and all kind of sort of swirling around in this sort of apolitical mush, where the Grateful Dead were sort of ending up as kind of the house band for it, in a way. And that's sort of the popular phrase to describe them, as sort of the house band of the acid tests and the acid era. Something going back to that period and reading about, which is kind of fascinating, is that a lot of times people who are writing about that psychedelic explosion in the 60s sort of treat the music as almost this secondary part of it, as kind of this, like this auxiliary product or something of psychedelics. But the Grateful Dead remain this constant thread, to the point where, because of their strong early connection with acid, through Owsley, who remained connected to them, their performances and just their scene in general became this magnet for people into psychedelics at all levels, and people taking it, but also people making it and distributing it. And kind of by the early 70s, the Grateful Dead were starting to function as this sort of ad hoc national distribution network for LSD. Not because they the musicians were doing it consciously, but because they were sort of the chosen flag bearers for this, broader thing. And by the mid 70s and later 70s, they were literally the wholesale network, where they would, pass through town and then there would be acid available in that town, and people would go to Dead shows and buy psychedelics wholesale, and then sell them basically at retail, and filter out into the local schools and the local arts communities and different places. Because of that, the Grateful Dead world itself kind of became this crossroads, kind of became this umbrella or a big tent, or kind of whatever metaphor you want to use, where all these different interests and, factions is maybe not totally the right word, but kind of these different affinity groups kind of could all come together in the world of the Grateful Dead at their shows and in the parking lot and on their concert tours. And it would be this, connection point where, everybody would be getting their acid. That's where the frat boys got their acid. That's where the scientists got their acid. One of the guys that I talked to from the Stanford Artificial Intelligence Lab was like, yeah, if we needed acid, I knew that we could go to a Grateful Dead show. And at every single Grateful Dead show I went to between, 1973 and in the 80s or 90s, there's this one guy that you would always see at every single show in like a big giant top hat. He had acid. It was just like this known thing. That was, where you went. It had all kinds of effects, and it sort of nurtured the bizarro Grateful Dead culture that connected all these things. And that's, kind of the bond that continues into the 21st century. That was still going on last summer at the 50th anniversary sort of quasi-reunion shows. One thing that I heard, that sort of, I wouldn't say is entirely confirmed, but that with the arrival of these Grateful Dead reunion shows last summer, there really was this kind of new arrival of LSD on sort of the underground market. And, prices at wholesale levels have apparently fallen as low as they've been since the late 90s in the early 21st century. And it's now a buyer's market again for the first time or 15 years. So, the Dead are still really connected to that thread as well. But since Jerry Garcia died in 1995, the culture has definitely gotten a lot wider and a lot broader. And all, it's all been positive and all fantastic. The psychedelic culture certainly needed more than just the Grateful Dead to sustain it. But I think kind of one of the points that I wanted to get across in my book is that the Grateful Dead really were that nurturing through line in these so-called dark years where, before the so-called psychedelic, renaissance, there was all of this stuff still happening, and that should be acknowledged and perhaps even celebrated.
And I think it should, because I think that's a huge part of the psychedelic experience is community. And I think without community, the psychedelic experience loses almost all of its value, if not a significant amount of its value, because I feel like even when people are now getting into, there's been a lot of research done into psychedelic therapy, and obviously in the 50s and 60s, there was a lot of research done into psychedelic therapy. The crux of the healing power of psychedelics, or the reason that people come to psychedelics, is to feel connected to other people. I think it's to feel like you're accepted. It's to feel like you're loved. It's to feel like you're bigger and part of something greater than yourself without the dogma attached to it that we know in most modern religions. And so I think, like you're saying, Grateful Dead and the community that they basically created and cultivated and maintained throughout these dark ages in the 70s and the 80s was critical to what is now going on today.
Yeah. And I think even just the acknowledgement that community created, that, psychedelics are a path to a larger truth about the universe, to, the truth of the fact that we are all kind of minds in the universe together. And, there is that community aspect of people who've taken these things, and, that it generates community in addition to sort of being a magnet for community, I think. I'm not sure which is the chicken and which is the egg in terms of LSD and community. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. No, and you're absolutely right. It's do people go searching for community first, or do they first find the LSD and then go find it? And I think it's both. We're drawn to it because we want to feel as part of a community. I mean, this is part of drug subculture. This is why, I smoked marijuana for the first time when I was 16. This is largely why I dropped LSD when I was 19. It's because you do it with close friends of yours, and there is, especially at a younger age, there's a certain aspect of you want to feel included, which sometimes can come from a point of insecurity, but at the same time, it's still a human urge where we need this feeling of connection.
And there's, and part of that feeling of connection, I think, connects again back to sort of that, that scene, kind of the condescending world, the anti-drug ads, the just say no stuff, where a huge part of psychedelics is bypassing, or at least a huge part of American psychedelics, I would say, is bypassing institutional authority, both in terms of the law, but being able to have these spiritual experiences without the mediation of a church or a formalized spiritual group. And the fact that, there is a common bond in bypassing these things together and sort of discovering all of that together, that maybe we're not being told the quote unquote truth about things. And that, and I think that really just even the legality or the non-legality of it, I think creates that bond. I mean, and that's true among all classes of illegal substance users, for sure, that there's that sort of outlaw bond that happens. But I think with psychedelics especially, that bond extends to sort of, bypassing traditional religions and stuff. And I think that is just that bypass is so important and powerful.
And I think it also bypasses a sense of external validation, which I think is what, like, for example, why teenagers smoke pot or why they drink alcohol, right? It's like you're validated by your peer group and your social group because you're doing something that's bad, something that's wrong. Whereas I think with psychedelics, it's coming from a point of wanting to discover who you are or who we are. And it's coming from a point of kind of like a point of health and desire to feel connected rather than a point of, I feel like I'm just being a rebel. And yeah, there's obviously an aspect of that. And the reason, of course, there's an aspect of it is because we do still have draconian drug laws. I do see there being definitely a difference between the approach to psychedelics compared to maybe other substances, for example, like underage drinking or whatever it might be, at least in the United States,
Yeah.
Obviously, in Europe, that's not an issue because everyone starts drinking when they're 14 because it's legal anyway. Thankfully, they have public transportation, so they don't have any of the issues that we have to deal with. But that's a little off track. My next question for you is, from your book, if you had to think of 3 stories, right, that really tie this biography of Psychedelic America together, would you have 3 stories, that would come to mind, or 2, and just specific little tidbits that you thought were interesting to research or that you were interesting to write about?
Yeah, I guess I'll tell you about some of the ones that were kind of most exciting to me because they're ones that I didn't really know getting into this. There's a big chapter in the sort of first part of the book that kind of some of the characters thread through it elsewhere as well, about the scene in Central Park in New York that was basically the group of teenage graffiti writers that started in the late 60s and became the one of the main East Coast West Coast connections for Orange Sunshine, and eventually became the East Coast West Coast connection for LSD Crystal, where there were these guys who were out and taking acid and really being pioneers of what's now this global art of graffiti, but we're also building this kind of black market network of sort of runaway teens that were, dealing LSD. And to me, that's fascinating. It illustrates the story in a bunch of ways. One, that there's sort of this ongoing youth culture that drives psychedelics that I think has a lot to do with the fact that when you're a teenager and when you're in your 20s, those are generally pretty prime years for exploring your liminal zones, for kind of pushing at your boundaries. So it kind of affirmed that in some sense to me, but all that there would be basically teenagers kind of in charge of this part of the network. And the thing that also that story illustrated for me was the continuity of the culture, which was something that I was looking to establish and was poking around for, but had no idea that I was going to find when I approached the graffiti guys, was that they were a link in the psychedelic distribution chain that existed from the 60s straight through to the 90s without interruption. And that's, I think, kind of this sort of important historical point as well, is that you read a lot of these books about psychedelic history, and they kind of detail the Brotherhood of Eternal Love, which was this, they created Orange Sunshine LSD, and they were this enormous global, drug smuggling network that brought hash into the United States and were responsible for all kinds of stuff,
like breaking Timothy Leary out of jail as well.
Yeah,
perfect
example. Yeah, using their money to pay the Black Panthers to break Leary out of jail. And so the official story of them is that they were busted in '72, and a bunch of them went on the run. Some of them went to jail. But the story that I discovered when I was talking to these dudes from Central Park is that while that was the official story, that's not really what happened. That there was maybe a little bit of a burp in the service in that they, it was maybe a little bit harder to get for a month or two, but there was really, it never stopped. The people that they were getting their stuff from on the West Coast just, passed it on to the next person, to the next person, to the next person. And actually, since the book came out, I had a conversation with the earliest graffiti artist / dealer in that chain who wrote graffiti under the name LSD Ohm. His name is Chad. And he was like, yeah, man, I read that chat, and I interviewed him for the book, and he was super great. And then he read the book, and like all, more memories started coming back from that period. Like, oh yeah, I kind of remember when there was that bust, and we had like, I remember there was kind of like, I wasn't dealing anymore, but there was like a meeting, like a meeting of the minds in Central Park, where it was kind of like explained that things were going to be a little bit different now, but basically the procedures were the same. So that's one story. That's like a really like, decade spanning story that I was not totally prepared to get when I started researching this, and was so happy to be able to put on paper. And I guess, I kind of picked and chose the character. The book is narrative nonfiction, where I kind of would take these different characters and use them to illustrate different parts of the bigger story. And like, those guys tell a big chunk of that story. And then one that kind of came into my research later that I was very excited to find and to meet was this woman, Sarah Matzer, who was, I guess what you would call an acid cook. She wasn't a proper chemist where she was, getting the precursor and converting it into, to LSD crystal. She was somebody who's like picking up the LSD crystal and then converting it into consumable form, into blotter or into gel tabs or into tablets or whatever. And she was the first person I was able to find who was really able to illustrate that part of the story. I'd found people at almost every other link of the distribution chain of, sort of down on street level or whatever. And I, talked a little bit to Roni Stanley, who worked in Owsley's labs, but I hadn't quite found anybody who really occupied the place that Sarah did. And she was a perfect illustrative example of somebody who worked within the Grateful Dead world, and was on Grateful Dead tour. So she wasn't dealing on Grateful Dead tour. She was just sort of part of that universe, but also connected to all kinds of other psychedelic worlds where she went to New York. She spent some time in New York where she was sort of connected to like the art punk world around CBGB, which is, not often acknowledged as a psychedelic scene, but certainly had, psychedelic proponents and stuff in there. So she was just an incredible narrative to connect those points and to sort of get a picture of the way, the Grateful Dead world was like I was saying, was really the mainstream of the psychedelic world, but was by no means the entirety of it. And, she told me a lot of on the record and off the record stories about how this stuff worked. Like one about how people would get LSD crystal, and it was mostly made in Europe, and then there was kind of this like little group of people who would then act to basically bring it over from that deeper level of chemists, of the people who are actually doing it, and then get it to people like Sarah. And then she was telling me about the network of people like her and sort of the range of people who were doing that. And some people were sort of like her in that she was doing a pretty thorough job, and she invented a method of making gel tabs, which I detail in the book. But there were also, this level of people who were just getting the LSD crystal, and she was telling me about this one guy who used to do like conversions in gas station bathrooms. He'd get like a portable humidifier and just lock himself in and do the whole thing in like 2 or 3 hours or something like that. So it's like sort of colorful detail at a level that I was hoping to find, but didn't until I found her. And so she's also, on top of that, while she was making LSD, was also getting her master's in anthropology, and is this incredible quilter. She studies Mayan textile making, and she's Guatemalan. At the same time that she was doing all of this, selling acid was also paying for her education and helping provide for her art. And she would say that, she believed in acid, and she didn't believe it was for everybody. But the reason she was doing this was for the money, in the sense that, she did think she was doing a good thing in terms of spreading LSD, as most people involved in LSD tend to believe. But she was doing it also to kind of to fund this art that she was doing, but also have it be sort of a creative resource for her art. I have a quilt by Sarah on my bed. It's beautiful, and you really see this sort of psychedelic quilting aesthetic that's sort of part traditional and part new.
And for me, that's always a fascinating aspect of psychedelic history and more like psychedelic culture, because I think, I wage this battle every day, so to say, in terms of, in the English language, we have a word, and it's drug, and the word drug explains a lot of things, and especially when people use the word to label or just to talk about drugs, the connotation is often one that is negative. And so obviously this is when LSD gets looped in with heroin, which gets looped in with crack cocaine, which gets looped in with crystal meth,
right.
How the federal government has scheduled it, unfortunately.
Right. How all drugs are bad. That's sort of kind of like the just say no. That was, one of the questions that obviously pops to mind
right.
when you see those ads. I don't know, but I don't know. Yeah, exactly.
But my point is, it's interesting to look at the people who were involved in psychedelic culture specifically, because I find a lot of those people to have been, and this isn't an overarching rule, but a lot of these people are people who they have a lot going for them. They're really intelligent. They're well educated. They're doing really creative art projects. They play really great music. Like, they have a lot going for them, so to say. Whereas from an outsider's perspective, and this is my point, the traditional perspective of a drug user or drug dealer is, and this evil persona, kind of like a crack cocaine dealer or like a heroin dealer, or like like Frank Lucas, in American Gangster, how he's like shooting and killing people, So it's interesting to see these personalities that come out of psychedelic culture, because oftentimes the who they are really interesting, creative, peaceful, loving people.
Yeah, well, they're heads, man.
Exactly.
But I mean, I think that's the difference between drug abuse and drug use. They're two. Drug abuse is something that's probably not great. There are drugs of abuse, but there are also drugs that are useful and extremely valuable. And I think that's where psychedelics fall. I mean, which isn't to say they can't be dangerous for some people and aren't don't serve everybody in the best way. But I think in the long run, the majority of people using psychedelics, I would say, are probably using them in the correct way for the right reasons or something like that.
On an overall basis, I think that's the case, and I think, and this
not
is
not that there can be correct or right, but I think I think you know what I mean.
But there's context, right? It is important to pay attention to set and setting on psychedelics. It is pretty important to watch your dose level, especially if it's your first time. It is, because things can go wrong, and I think that's part of accepting the psychedelic experience.
And I think that's actually one of the great lessons of these last 50 years of psychedelics, even though they've been illegal, is that there is this incredible body of what's basically folk knowledge that has emerged around it, where sometimes there are, scientific studies to back them up, but there's that basic information like set and setting, are so valuable and so basically universal for these experiences. And the psychedelic world has done a really good job of spreading information. Like, the knowledge of this stuff is pretty well, is part of it as well. Like, you look at sites like Arrowhead, and you look at, the books that the Shulgins put out, and education is clearly an important part of psychedelic use, whether or not they're legal or not.
Absolutely, and this is, I think, the power of the age that we're in now. What I have termed the third wave of psychedelics, what other people are calling the psychedelic renaissance, is we're at an age now where, with the internet, information is freely available at our fingertips, and instead of relying, in the past, really pre-internet, or really even pre-2000, information dissemination has largely been through the government, and that's often because they have consolidation of power and money and resources. And now with the internet, that is changing. And I think and this is happening with marijuana right now, for example,
right,
which is a point that you talked about in your book as well, this relationship between cannabis and psychedelics.
Right.
And I think, people are waking up to the fact that, like, something seriously fucked up right now.
Right.
You know what I mean? And and psychedelics are just one tool in this catalyst of change, where more and more people are being drawn towards self-healing, right? More and more people are realizing, okay, maybe like this whole kind of corporation, working for a corporation 60 hours a week, hating my life during the week, working for the weekends, eating McDonald's, watching television. Maybe there's something not so healthy about that.
Right.
And we see now psychedelics as a tool to help mend these issues. And there are other ones as well. I think the movement towards there are more and more people who are doing yoga. There are more and more people who are, I think, spending time outside and going hiking. I think there are more and more people who are paying attention to where their food comes from, factory farming and trying to minimize that. So I think it's a whole move towards like this catalyst towards higher consciousness, so to say.
Yeah, mindfulness.
Mindfulness. I think. That's a great way. Yeah, meditation is another one, right?
Yeah, and I think there's absolutely no coincidence that that's the Greek prefix for psychedelic is mind, and that psychedelic literally means mind manifesting. One of the things that I came across for an article I was reading recently was kind of like this little bit of text deep in in Tycho, in the second Sasha and Ann Shulgin book, where they're talking about the etymology, or Sasha's writing about the etymology of the word psychedelic and all the which we talked about a little bit before with Humphrey Osmond, but talking about a bunch of different variations that had been proposed for it, which none of which I had really knew before, which were like psychophoric, which means mind moving, psychohormic, I'm looking at this right now, is mind rousing, psychozemic, which means mind fermenting, psychohexic, which means mind bursting forth, psycholytic, which means mind releasing, and I think there's kind of like a meta lesson to be taken here that connects to kind of this third wave thing, where I think one of the defining characteristics of the third wave, or the Renaissance or the psychedelic spring is another expression I've heard for it, is now this ability to draw on this body of knowledge from the previous generations of psychedelic users in a way that those previous generations weren't able to draw on the people who came before them. Because there's now this democratized internet of information that's just accessible to people, and you can you can search through Arrowhead experience reports to see to learn about polydrug safety, what combinations of drugs are safe to put with other drugs, or whatever, or learn about the safety of things in general, or or even get down into the granular study of things like the mushroom voice, which is this, large phenomenon in the psychedelic world that now having access to all these tools makes it just so much easier to study and understand. That all of those things and more differentiate this sort of present moment from everything that's happened.
And you're absolutely correct. And this is a good segue into the last question that I want to ask you, which is basically, how will the internet and what's going to happen? What do you think is going to happen? And this is obviously pure speculation, but in the next 5 to 10 years, in terms of the changing cultural tide around psychedelic?
I mean, that's, it's so hard to say. The crypto market is such a fascinating change in the way that the wholesale of drugs has evolved, and it happens so quickly that it's hard for me to even get my head around what might possibly happen to it next. But certainly that seems like one ongoing development is sort of the change of the wholesale drug distribution model, at least for psychedelics. I think a huge thing that has an impact on psychedelics, but really only as sort of like a smaller side effect, is kind of this real explosion of microcultural, or what used to be thought of as microcultural information through social media. And I think it's kind of leading to this really amazing and incredible and inspiring large-scale liberation of, that ties together, sort of Black Lives Matter and sort of this contemporary civil rights movement. And it ties together sort of this new understanding and new acceptance of gay marriage and transgender issues, where you have all these voices that were previously really marginalized and looked down upon in these awful ways, where there are now these platforms for people to say things loud and proud. And to me, that's just so amazing and so powerful, and psychedelics fits into that in such a big way that it's hard not to see all of those things as one giant cultural wave that I don't think we'll really be able to understand for another couple of decades. This wave of people coming forth and declaring nonviolent freedoms for themselves that they deserve. And the internet is such a powerful amplifier for that. And especially in the last 10 years has been, that I think the openness around psychedelics is just broadening. there's so many psychedelic podcasts now. I went to this event the other night in New York called run by the group Symposia, which is sort of a psychedelic storytelling night, where a lot of it is the sort of coming out of the psychedelic closet kind of belief set. And I think just the sort of the changing public perception, I think, is just so cool to watch. And I think that's kind of what I'm keeping my eye on the most.
And I like the way you put that. And I think one thing that I've read about this change in consciousness is like you're saying, the democratization of the internet is enabling people's true self to really come out and be accepted in their identity. to
right. Or their true selves to be like revealed in all its naked awfulness, as you sometimes see in sort of Twitter land or wherever. it swings both ways, but obviously for the psychedelic world, I see that as a hugely positive thing.
Thanks so much for coming and talking to us today about the history of Psychedelic America. We've covered a lot about everything from your story growing up with a dad that was out in California in the 60s, kind of tying into why that inspired you to really dig deep into the history of Psychedelic America with, the stories that we talked about with mescaline being shipped and Gordon Wasson and obviously then with the Grateful Dead and the Deadheads and the culture and community that they created around psychedelics was a really powerful play and a really powerful part of where we are today. So Jesse, I just want to thank you for coming on. It was a pleasure to have you and it was a pleasure to talk to you.
Cool. Really appreciate it. That was a really fun conversation.
Great. Well, we'll talk soon.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Talk to you soon.
Thanks for listening to the Psychedelia Podcast with Paul Austin. Want more psychedelic information? Go to our website at thethirdwave.co and register for our email list and newsletter. Also, please consider donating to The Third Wave via our Patreon page. Donations make this podcast possible. Psychedelics have the potential to transform lives. By donating, you enable us to continue to inform people about the benefits of these powerful substances.